I woke from a thin, broken sleep to the pale square of mourning on Adrian's wall, and the feeling that the day had already begun without me. Perhaps it had. All night the city had creaked and whispered beneath the loft windows. The hiss of late buses, a siren unraveling somewhere toward the river, the muted thud of a neighbor setting something heavy on a floor. None of it settled me. When I finally dozed, I dreamed of a kettle ringing on a cold stove, and a door that would not open no matter how many times I turned the key. By the time I padded barefoot into the kitchen, Adrian was dressed with the kind of care that says a man has decided what the day must become and chosen armor to match it. His jacket lay across a chair, his tie draped over the back, his phone lit with a column of names and times. He glanced up, took in whatever my face was doing, and poured coffee into the chipped blue mug he always left for me. "We have to assume she's moving," he said, without preface. "Margaret won't wait. She never waits." "She pushes," I nodded and wrapped both hands around the mug. The metal taste I'd noticed yesterday had returned. Now I recognized it as adrenaline. "Aurora first," I said. "Whatever we do, I need to see that place in daylight, when people look like themselves." He set his phone face down. "And Samuel, he's shaking too hard to speak," I said. "She frightened him yesterday. If I go back too soon, I'll only make him feel hunted by both sides." Adrian's mouth tightened. "Then we'll create a space where fear doesn't fit." "How?" I asked. "We changed the scale," he answered simply. "Margaret keeps her world small. Rooms she dominates, corridors she can supervise with a glance. We widen it until she can't see every corner." He spoke like an engineer, which he is in everything but degree. "Build the thing you need, and if it doesn't exist, design it." We ate in silence, 2 slices of buttered toast neither of us tasted, and then he drove me to Aurora, where the gravel in the circular drive was too clean to be real and the columns rose as if scolded into height. In daylight, the place felt even more like a set. The marble gleamed, the palms in the lobby looked perpetually watered, and the receptionist smiled with an exactness that must have been trained. I took a seat near the window and pretended to leaf through a brochure. A man in a wheelchair blinked drowsily at the view of pines. A nurse passed, steady as a metronome. Across the hall, a volunteer in a mint sweater arranged magazines so that no cover offended another. Margaret arrived 15 minutes later, as if the hall had been waiting to become real until she entered it. Her suit today was charcoal. The pearls at her throat sat like perfect punctuation. People rearranged themselves in her wake. I watched the small choreography she never knew she performed, the pause to let admiration catch up to her, the precise angle at which she tilted her head to indicate benevolence without intimacy, the way she flattened her palm on the desk as if blessing the receptionist with the privilege of her time. Marjorie appeared with a cart piled high with towels that were already folded, which told me the cart existed to move Marjorie rather than towels. I rose and drifted parallel to her down the corridor, keeping the magazines visible in my hand. She pushed her cart through a fire door into a service hallway that smelled of metal and detergent. When we were alone with the hum of vents, she said without looking at me, "You shouldn't be here in the open. She's got eyes even in walls." "She's got eyes," I said, "but you have stories. Yesterday you said she keeps a book." "I saw it. I photographed it. I need more, anything that ties her to real names, real favors." Marjorie parked the cart as if she had always meant to. "I've kept my head down 10 years, she said. "Some days I thought I'd lost it entirely. But there are things even keeping your head down doesn't save you from." Her lips tightened at the memory. "I'll give you a list, not of the patients, you won't get me to break that, but of suppliers, drivers, vendors, people who see invoices change after she visits the office, people who see boxes arrive with no signatures. If you knock on enough doors, you'll find the one that opens." "Why help me?" I asked softly. "Because I saw you in that towel in the courtyard," she said without turning. "Word runs through a building like water. And because I have a daughter your age and I don't want her learning that a woman like Whitmore can decide which parts of you count as public." She pushed the cart forward. "Wait by the vending machines at noon." I did. At noon. She left a folded page on the chair beside me and kept walking. I slipped it into my bag without opening it. Later at the loft, I spread it beside the ledger photographs and felt the first nose of hope rise like a bird, a cascade of names, not all of whom would be afraid. Adrian came home mid-afternoon with a look I recognized from our childhood, the one that meant he had placed a stone at the beginning of a long line of dominoes and now had only to tap. "I spoke to Monroe," he said. "And to Ellis. Those are last names you use when you want me not to worry," I said. "They're lawyers who intend to remain without names until it is useful for them to have them," he said. "Monroe thinks the ledger photographs are good enough to scare, not good enough to prosecute. Ellis agrees. They both want a witness who can testify under oath about how the loans were made, how the payments were enforced, and who took the bribes noted in the margins. Samuel, I said, and if not Samuel, someone like him, Adrian nodded. And because I know you, I also called Elliot. The name meant a face instantly. Elliot Grant, who used to run event logistics for one of Adrian's factories, and could disappear in a crowd by deciding to. He was also the kind of loyal that makes dangerous plans plausible. Why Elliot? I asked, though I already knew. Because he can make a thing look like another thing, Adrian said. And because I've asked him to retrieve some files that might otherwise get lost. We spent the rest of the afternoon deciding what to ask the world for and how. I called 3 vendors from Marjorie's list under the polite pretense of confirming deliveries for a charity project. 2 of them told me nothing and 1 left me on hold until the line died. But a 4th, Montrose Distributors, a small company that provided disposable gloves and paper goods, answered on the first ring. And when I asked about invoice adjustments authorized by volunteer coordinators at Aurora, the man paused for a beat too long. We don't discuss client arrangements, he said. I understand, I answered. But if you're ever asked about backdated deliveries or boxes that don't go through receiving, I let the sentence hang unhelpfully, then added, you'll be hearing from Monroe. You're good at this, he said quietly. I'm good because she made me practice, I answered. Evening came with thunder that only threatened, and wind that could not decide whether to perform or not. I called Helena and told her to leave the porch light off for a few nights. It made her feel more exposed than comforted. She laughed a little at herself and complied. Then I set the kettle from Samuel's ledger on the table, ran my hand over the dent near the spout, and wondered how a man keeps baking after he has had something like this taken from him. The next morning, Adrian woke me early. Samuel, he said. Now we drove with the rooftops still silvered by dew. The bakery smelled better today, as if the ovens had decided to remember what bread means. Samuel stood behind the counter, wiping perfectly clean glass with a cloth that had already done its work. I brought you something, I said. I lifted the tarp in the trunk to reveal the old silver kettle. In the morning light it looked less like a trophy and more like a ghost. Samuel's mouth opened and closed. He reached out and touched the handle once, as if it might burn him, then flinched and drew his hand back to his chest. How she kept it in a safe, I said, with things that mattered to her for the wrong reasons. He swallowed, and the swallow carried words down it. I made tea in that kettle every morning for 30 years, he said. My father did too, before me. I don't know why I kept it on the shelf in the shop when everything else went. Habit, I suppose, or hope. He blinked hard. When she took it, I didn't make tea for a week. The water boiled in a pot and tasted like tin. You can have it back, I said softly. All of it, but I need you to stand in the light long enough for others to see who took it. He stared at me as if I had asked him to lift the city by its foundations. You don't know her, he said. You think you do because she's hurt you, but you don't know what she keeps in her pocket. I know, I said. I do, because I've felt that pocket turn out. I let him look at me long enough to measure whether I meant it. We can do this without your name if we must, but you don't want that either. You want to look at this kettle on your stove and know that it was your voice that made it possible. The bell over the door startled all 3 of us with its cheerfulness. A woman entered with a small boy who looked exactly like a person who had been promised a cinnamon roll. Samuel served them with hands that steadied as they moved, which told me there was still a baker in him, and the baker might yet be braver than the debtor. When they left, he said, If I speak, you'll protect my wife. Yes, I said. And before he could doubt, Adrian added, We will. We'll put in writing what happens if anything happens to you. There are ways to make powerful people trip if they step where we've hidden the string. Samuel nodded once, a baker's nod. Practical, not theatrical. Give me a day. We left him with the kettle wrapped in a towel he fetched from a drawer that had not seen a towel in months. In the car, Adrian exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since before dawn. That was the hinge, he said. If it swings, the door opens. At home, I found a plain envelope slid under Adrian's door. Inside was a short note in that same looping hand. You were seen at the bakery. She is listening. No signature, no advice, only fact. I held the paper to the light for a watermark out of habit. Now there was none. I burned it in the sink, watched the ash float, and felt a familiar mix of gratitude and dread toward my invisible ally. The day filled itself with necessary errands. A visit to the notary Monroe preferred. Photocopies of the ledger photographs labeled and stored in 3 separate envelopes that would go to 3 separate safes. A simple recorder purchased in a shop where the owner talked too loudly about security systems while selling cables. I walked home along the river and practiced questions for Samuel aloud. Not because I needed to coach him, but because saying the words made them more true. That evening, Elliot arrived the way Elliot always arrives, knocking a rhythm that no one else would use, and smiling with half his mouth like a man who has discovered a secret in the room, and intends to use it later. He looked exactly as forgettable as useful men do. Brown jacket, brown hair, brown eyes that saw every exit without turning toward them. "You want noise," he said to Adrian when they had shaken hands the way old friends do, without needing to ask what the years have done, or the illusion of it. "Both," Adrian said. "Enough noise in one place to make other places quiet." They bent over the floor plan of the Whitmore apartment, the version our ally had provided, and spoke in a dialect made of nouns and angles. I listened, because my part of the plan could not proceed without theirs. I would go where Margaret kept the symbols that made her feel powerful, but first we would draw her attention away from that place, make the night heavy in another direction. "What do you need from me?" I asked when their conversation had stacked itself into a neat, dangerous shape. Elliot looked at me with a kind of polite candor I liked him for. "You don't panic," he said. "That's what I need. If a light goes on that shouldn't, you're a woman who belongs where she is. If a guard speaks, you're a woman who's tired of being delayed. If a door sticks, you pull it quietly. You don't stop because stopping makes people wonder why you started." "I can do that," I said. "I've been doing it all my life," they smiled. And the plan went from being a set of instructions to being a thing with breath. The next morning, Samuel called. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent a night arguing with himself and had finally convinced the stronger part. "I'm in," he said. "I'll say what she did." We met him at Monroe's office, where the waiting room smelled like new carpet and the receptionist appraised shoes with professional discretion. Monroe had the kind of hands that make juries think of safety belts. He set a recorder on the table and asked Samuel questions in a voice that never once suggested Samuel might be too small for what he was about to do. Samuel told the story I had suspected, and worse, the surprise inspection that wasn't a surprise to anyone who had heard Margaret threaten it. The supplier who dropped flour with the apology of a man whose contract had been bought out from under him. The electrician who found a wire frayed that had been new the week before. The loan Margaret offered when Samuel's savings bled out. Money in cash, interest that changed when she felt like changing it. A note he signed in panic with a pen she provided. He told how, when the bakery failed, she had arrived with her glove-soft condolences and her men with a van. They took the equipment, the storefront, the kettle. They took his name out of the window with a hand steadier than his had been when he painted it there. Monroe asked him to read the entry from the ledger that bore his name. He did. The room was quiet in the way rooms are when all the air is doing work. When it was done, Monroe turned off the recorder, slid a glass of water toward Samuel, and said, "We'll file this under 2 names and 2 dates. If anything happens to you or your wife, it will be difficult for those responsible to claim coincidence." Samuel closed his eyes for a second and nodded again. "I don't know if I'll sleep," he said, "but I'll try to remember how it used to feel to wake up." When he left, Adrian stayed behind with Monroe to discuss order of operations. I walked out to the street and breathed in the ordinary heat of noon and texted Helena to ask about the roses. "They're unruly," she replied. "Like children who've learned their strength." I smiled like a woman who has never broken into a safe. Afternoon shaded toward evening. Elliot texted a time, 7:15, and a single instruction: drive to the gates. Turn on the tracker. Leave. He had managed to get access to Victor's car's app, which was easier than it ought to be because Victor trusted convenience more than he feared intrusion. The alert would send them racing to the wrong address. It was a risky play, but Margaret believed in her ability to be everywhere at once. We would exploit her faith in herself. At 6 o'clock I braided my hair tight and packed my bag with the small tools that had already once changed the direction of my life. Gloves, flashlight, the slim crowbar that slept under Adrian's couch when not in my tote. I wore the plainest clothes I owned. The world is fond of looking away from plain women carrying canvas bags. Adrian kissed my forehead in the doorway like he had when I was 8 and insisted on going up the tallest slide. "Call me as soon as you're out," he said, which was both a benediction and a command. Elliot's part went first. He drove Victor's car to the gates of the Whitmore's country property, parked exactly where the geofenced alert would sound most dramatic, and tapped the tracker. He waited 15 minutes as agreed, then left. On his way back, he texted a single word, bait. I went in with the catering team again because the best cover is the one you've already worn convincingly. The kitchen thrummed. Margaret, radiant with the effort of radiance, directed. Victor looked paler than champagne. I kept my head down, my hands competent, and my breath even. The study waited, locked, but I did not go there first. I went to the bedroom where the vanity held a tray of rings that would have purchased a car, and took a photograph not of the jewelry but of the very particular arrangement of dust in the corner of the frame. Later Monroe would explain why that mattered, because dust tells how often a drawer is opened and how recently it has been disturbed. Then the alert must have sounded because Victor made the face men make when their phones announce the future has arrived without asking. He showed Margaret the screen. She didn't curse, she never does in public. She smiled a hard little smile and said something to him that made his jaw sharpen. They left in a flurry of coats and whispered orders. The apartment emptied by half, the chaos thinned to the efficient hurry of people who want to do their jobs and go home. I slipped into the study. The dial on the safe spun under my fingers as if it preferred to be opened by me. The album was not there, I had it, and the kettle was not there. It was on Samuel's counter now, but the envelopes waited like obedient soldiers. I opened one. Inside were photocopies of correspondence. No originals. Margaret was not that foolish. Between a deputy mayor's office and a shell company whose owner did not exist in any public record. I photographed every page. In another envelope, a list of donors to a health initiative Margaret had chaired, complete with notes in the margin that translated donations into services, inspection waived, license rushed, complaint misplaced. I photographed those too. I left the envelopes exactly as I found them because theater matters in law as much as in life. When I closed the safe, I heard the wrong sound, a stair that creaked in the hall when no one I knew should be walking there. I turned off my light, eased the door a finger's width, and peered out. A young waiter passed, humming. I let air back into my chest. 10 minutes later, I was out the back into the small yard blooming with lilacs, and then into the alley where Adrian had parked. I called before I shut the car door. Out, I said. Good, he answered. And the one syllable held more tenderness than I could have borne if he had used any more. We drove not home but to Monroe's office because you don't let paper like that sleep in an apartment with windows. He scanned the images, made backups of backups, and told us to go eat something salty and laugh loudly in a public place, so that anyone following us would have to work through strangers to hear our breathing. We did as he said and found a noisy bar by the river, where I ordered fries I didn't taste and listened to Adrian tell an improbable story about a truck shipment that had once gone the wrong direction for 100 miles. I laughed too loudly at the right moments and watched the door more than the bartender. Being safe is exhausting. At home, I texted Helena, "I'm all right," and turned off my phone. I fell asleep the way a soldier does whose ears have learned when to let go. Morning brought a different kind of work. Monroe began to draft letters that would go to officials whose names lived in the margins of Margaret's ledger. Elliot arranged to have photocopies appear, untraceably, in the mailboxes of two reporters known for disliking bullies. Adrian met with Ellis to discuss what happens when an empire built on favors finds it owes one to someone it cannot afford to repay. I went to Aurora and sat in the lobby with my quiet face on, because sometimes the most effective thing is to make a presence a habit until it seems unremarkable. Margaret saw me that afternoon. She did not break stride because she would never give me that satisfaction. But when she passed, she paused half a heartbeat and adjusted the cuff of her suit in a motion that was more violent than a cuff deserves. I smiled at her exactly the way she smiled at the women who fetched her coffee, pleasant, self-contained, uninterested in extremity. It infuriated her. I saw it in the pulse at her temple. That night Helena told me over the phone what she had not told me in her kitchen. That before her wedding, Margaret had come to my father and told him Helena was unfit, that she would make him small, that she would give him ordinary days when he deserved a stage. "Your father," Helena said, laughed. "He said ordinary days with me were better than grand ones with anyone else." She never forgave him for preferring our small happiness to her large misery. I held the phone and thought about ordinary days, toast that is not burned, a kettle that boils on schedule, a woman who can step out of the shower and put on a robe without having to brace against an insult. Ordinary days are the ones tyrants think beneath them. They are also the ones that outlast tyrants. The following afternoon, Samuel called again. "She came," he said, voice flat. "To the bakery, yes. She told me it would be a pity if the health inspector revisited. She said it would be a shame if the landlord finally listened to the complaints about smell." He drew a breath that scraped. "But I told her I'd already spoken to a lawyer. I told her if anyone came to my door with a badge, I'd call a reporter second." "How did she take that?" I asked. "She smiled," he said. "Like she always smiles, and then she picked up a loaf of bread and said she'd forgotten how good it smells when it's hot." There was a pause. "She paid too much for it, Clara. She left money on the counter like a woman who thinks money fixes everything. Sometimes it breaks it faster," I said. We set a date for Samuel's formal statement to be filed. We arranged for his wife to stay with her sister for a week. Adrian had Elliot check the locks on Samuel's back door and the bulb over his stoop light. Monroe wrote a letter that would go to the deputy mayor the morning after the statement was filed. A polite question about the appearance of certain notes in a private ledger, and whether the office wished to comment before a story went to press. It was the sort of letter that makes men sweat under clean shirts. The anniversary dinner, the public one at the River Restaurant, came and went like a parade seen through rain. Photographs appeared on the society pages, Margaret in pale blue, Victor beside her, both of them smiling with their teeth. I looked carefully at Victor's eyes and found the emptiness there that follows fear when fear has nowhere left to expand. When the party ended, Elliot texted a single word, "Home." 2 days later, the reporters began to call. Ellis handled most of them, which meant he told them enough to keep the story warm and not enough to let it burn our hands. One of them, a woman whose articles had once frightened a developer into building a park, asked to speak to me off the record. I said no, and then I said yes, and then I said no again. In the end I sent her a photograph of the kettle and nothing else. She replied with a single sentence, "Some people keep what they should return." I was hanging laundry on Helena's line when 2 men appeared at the end of the walk. They wore suits that did not fit their bodies or the weather. The taller one smiled with the kind of smile men use when they want you to forget that smiling is another way of baring teeth. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked. "Ms. Whitmore," I said. "And if you're selling gutters, you should know this house doesn't need them." He appreciated the line enough to laugh. "We're not selling anything," he said. "We're from the city licensing office. We'd like to speak with you about certain allegations concerning the Aurora Health Retreat." "Of course," I said. "Please show me your identification." They did. It was real. I called Monroe while they waited and put him on speaker. He told them in the friendliest possible tone that any questions should be routed through his office and that if they had paperwork to serve, they were welcome to leave it. They did not. They left cards. When they had gone, Helena exhaled and said, "You were right about the porch light." That night, Margaret called Victor from a number Adrian had long ago arranged to mirror on his phone. She told him she would be visiting the country house for a few days, for quiet, she said, which meant to burn things, and told him to have the staff stay away. Victor agreed, because agreeing had become the only reflex his muscles remembered. Adrian listened to the recording with me at the kitchen table. He sipped his tea. "She'll take Sem and leave Sem," he said. "The leaving is the mistake. We agreed to let her go. We had enough for now, a witness, documents photographed, a ledger, and the certainty that she was scared. Scared people either freeze or flail. Margaret flailed elegantly. The next morning she appeared at Aurora as if she hadn't been to the country in months and sent Marjorie home early for the sin of being slower by a step than usual. Marjorie called me from the bus stop. "She's hunting," she said. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster." We did. Monroe filed Samuel's statement. Ellis sent the deputy mayor's office the letter with its polite deadline. The reporter with the developer story called again to say, "You'll want to be near a television tomorrow." She would not say more. I did not ask. Sometimes asking is a way of telling a person you're not ready to hear the answer. The next day at 10 in the morning, a local news station ran a segment about loan sharking in polite clothes, about medical facilities where money moves through hands that are never photographed, about interest rates that would make a casino blush. They did not say Margaret's name. They did not have to. The camera panned slowly over the facade of Aurora. It lingered a heartbeat too long on the rising sun over the letter A. Margaret called Victor 3 times in 15 minutes. Adrian watched the calls arrive, each one a needle tipped with acid. Then she called me. "You think you've done something magnificent," she said, not wasting time on greeting. "But you've done nothing but make yourself ugly in public." "Truth is homely at first," I said. "It grows beautiful when people stop trying to make it wear the wrong dress. You always had a mouth on you," she said. "It's a wonder Victor tolerated it as long as he did. It's a wonder I tolerated the Whitmores as long as I did," I said. And then I hung up, because the only pleasure she ever got from a conversation was the part where she could make it last. That evening, Samuel texted a photograph of the kettle in its proper place on his stove. Beneath it he wrote, "Tea tastes like tea." I looked at the image for a long time and wept. Not because of the kettle, but because of what returning it meant, that a thing can go wrong for a long time and still be put right in the end. 4 days later, the deputy mayor hosted a press conference about a new initiative to streamline health inspections. Reporters asked hard questions in voices that did not pretend to be soft. He smiled and said the initiative had been planned for months. Afterward, Ellis received a letter from the deputy mayor's office, calling our allegations baseless and defamatory. He framed it and hung it on his wall. "That's the sound of fear," he said. "We kept going because momentum is its own kind of safety." Elliot found a driver who had ferried brown envelopes from Margaret's car to a back entrance at City Hall. The driver did not know what was in the envelopes but knew exactly how heavy they were and what they smelled like: toner and worry. Marjorie found an old email chain in which Margaret had recommended a contractor whose bid had later turned out to be perfectly tailored to the needs of a councilman's nephew. Samuel's wife came home from her sister's. He met her at the door with tea. One afternoon, as I left Aurora, I saw Victor at the curb, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone who ought to apologize. He looked up when I passed and opened his mouth, then closed it again. For a moment I saw a man at a crossroads trying to remember which direction he had hoped to take before he let someone else fold his map. I did not stop, not because I am cruel but because mercy given too early makes a person think he earned it. That night the anonymous ally left a final note. She hid a backup. Not in the country house, in town. There was an address, a storage unit, and a code, 1285, the date of the accident again, the one she considered sacred. I looked at Adrian. "We go," I said. "We went at dawn when the city smells like bread and exhaust and a kind of rest that doesn't last." The storage facility's gate opened with a complaint. The unit itself was a small corrugated cave. Inside, boxes labeled with female handwriting that tried to look like a secretary's and failed. A woman's hand knows how to pretend to be a different class, not a different sex. We opened them with a knife Adrian carried for opening shipments, receipts, photocopies, an old planner that had grown a spine of rubber bands. In a tin box lined with velvet, always theater, there were USB drives, each labeled with a letter and a date. We did not plug them into anything. We sealed the tin in a bag and drove it directly to Monroe. He looked as excited as a restrained man lets himself look in an office. "This is better than photographs," he said. "This is metadata. Metadata tells stories people forget to delete." We left him to his feast. Outside on the sidewalk, the day had become itself. We stood for a minute without speaking. The river made its small, constant noises. Somewhere a bus let off a sigh. I thought of the first morning after Victor threw me out, the way the air tasted like shame, and compared it to this morning, which tasted like work done by people who intend to win. The difference between those mornings was not justice. Justice takes longer. It was simply the knowledge that we were not alone. That evening I went to Helena's to water the roses. She came out with 2 glasses and we sat on the steps like women who have decided to be honest with time. "Do you hate her?" she asked me at last. It was the first time she had asked the question that had been between us since the album. "I don't know," I said, and realized I was telling the truth. Hate is a place where the world gets small. "She lives there already. If I move there too, she'll have won twice," Helena nodded. "Your father would have liked that answer," she said. "He never wasted a minute on a room that had no windows." We watched the light change on the roses. We did not talk about Margaret again. The day had been full of her. It did not need to end that way. 2 mornings later Monroe called at 6. "We have enough to make it through a weekend," he said, "which means we might have enough to make it through a trial. But you need to be ready for what happens when she understands the horizon has a shape." "What shape?" I asked. "The shape of a door that closes," he said. "And people like Margaret don't walk through doors that close. They try to break the hinges." We tightened our own hinges. Elliot checked the locks again. Adrian bought a second fireproof safe. I put fresh batteries in the flashlight, even though I did not plan to get near a dark room for a while. Samuel baked more bread than he could sell and handed it to neighbors just to feel the weight of generosity in his arms. When the first warrant arrived, for records at Aurora unrelated on paper to Margaret but adjacent in practice, she responded with a suit and a press release about respect for privacy. The suit went nowhere because it had been designed to make noise, not law. The press release impressed no one who had smelled the inside of an envelope. The deputy mayor suddenly discovered he needed to spend more time with family. Reporters smiled with their pens. A councilman stopped returning Margaret's calls. The health initiative found a new chair. On the evening that marked exactly 2 weeks since Victor had pushed me into the yard in a towel, I stood in Helena's kitchen stirring soup. The kettle on the stove sang. Not Samuel's kettle. His was where it belonged, but a plain one with a chipped handle. The sound it made, ordinary as a heartbeat, felt like an anthem. I turned off the gas and set bowls on the table and told my mother that tomorrow I intended to go back to Aurora one more time. Not to steal or to spy, but to sit in the lobby and read a book like a woman who believes the world should be safe for reading. "Wear the blue dress," Helena said. "It makes you look like yourself," I smiled. I think I finally remember who that is. Part 2 of this story does not end with an arrest. It does not end with sirens or handcuffs or a judge's gavel finding the desk with a heavy, satisfying sound. It ends with preparations, with paper stacked neatly in files with names written legibly on tabs, with a baker lighting the flame under an old kettle, and a cleaner dropping a note into a woman's hand at a vending machine, and a brother ordering a second safe. It ends with an empire that has discovered it can be seen. It ends with me, sitting very still in a lobby built for pretense, reading a book whose plot has not yet reached its climax and savoring, for once, the strength that comes from waiting without fear.